Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked, going through all the week's sports news with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Martyn Ziegler from The Times, and Tariq Panja from The New York Times. All of us here so you can listen to the number one sports podcast in Madagascar this week.
Number one. Bonjour, Madagascar.
Certainly means we're going to have to do an episode from there.
This summer, Madagascar, fancy it?
Why not? Why not indeed?
So how's everyone's travels been this week? Martyn, what have you been up to?
I was on a panel at the British Association for Sport and Law at the Queen's Club in London, talking about all the issues facing football, with Nicola Palios from Tranmere Rovers and Miguel Delaney from The Independent.
Well, a lot of sports and football finance issues to get into later in this episode. Tariq, you've been going a bit further afield.
Yeah, a little bit further. Was in Istanbul for a couple of days for a work trip. God, you realise it is such a football city. There was teams in Istanbul with stadiums that you're still discovering after all this time, one near our hotel there. And it made me think, when they host the Euros in 2032, that place will be absolutely bouncing. Getting around might be tricky, I must say. The traffic jams are something happy to leave behind, but it should be an incredible atmosphere of that tournament.
And Rob, you seem to have developed a bit of a French accent. Have you been somewhere?
Yeah, a few days in Paris this week, checking in on some of the preparations for the Olympics. In fact, a bit of a rare sight. I was in part of the IOC Paris 2024 Coordination Commission meetings as they were meeting for the first time in almost a year, the final one of these before the Games, as various officials from the IOC, the sports, the national federations, the NOCs all get together, and went on a bit of a sort of tour with them to see some of it. And a lot of focus was on the opening ceremony.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. I mean, this sort of incredible event that they're planning, instead of the stadiums, having a stadium with athletes walking around it, they're going to actually have them on boats going down the river with hundreds of thousands of people lining the banks. But I think you were reporting, Rob, that there's security concerns around that, and they're going to have to sort of probably cut the number of spectators.
Yeah, just this week, the French Interior Minister telling the Senate that no longer would there be freely accessible tickets on the upper banks of the Seine. Instead, they'd be by invitation only. They've already reduced the numbers in total from around 600,000 to 300,000. But they are determined to keep this ambitious opening ceremony. I think one of the things that stood out to me talking about it is how dull the athlete parade is usually in the stadium, and this will certainly liven things up as they parade down the river on boats. But speaking to Christophe Duby, the executive director of the Olympic Games, he was saying the plan is just too sophisticated now to abandon it completely, although they would downscale it further if they had to.
Yeah, should we just unpack what that plan is a bit? So that is a flotilla of boats with the teams on each of these boats, whether they're all together, like as teams of USA, Britain, etc., we don't know. 150 police and army boats alongside them, 6 kilometers of the Seine. As one of my colleagues said, that is a lot of windows to pass in the middle of Paris. The security operation will be something, won't it?
Yeah, massive challenge for them. But I think you're right. The walk past by the athletes is always the dullest bit of the Olympic opening ceremony. And also, increasingly, athletes don't take part in it because they don't want to be on their feet for 4 hours, waiting around for a long time, especially with those who've got events coming up in the next few days. So I think we've seen fewer and fewer athletes actually taking part, but I imagine they will be quite keen to be involved in this once in a lifetime chance, in a way, to show something which has never happened before at the Games.
Yeah, it's interesting speaking to just a few Paris locals that we approached randomly on camera, and there was one who thought the whole place could be just too heavily policed and they're going to flee Paris. Another person saying, just shows they're actually secure in the place, so it should be pretty safe, they're hoping for, in terms of the overall plan.
The thing with Paris in the summer, in fleeing, they flee anyway. That's the thing, and that's what the people organising the Olympics are banking on anyway. The idea that the city will be flooded with people and too packed might turn out not to be the case, and that's the best hope, because up to 30% of Parisians leave the city that every summer, and maybe they're thinking 15% will come in, so they'll still be perhaps 15% down on if we go today to Paris, for example, in the middle of March. And that is the hope. So it might not be as packed as people are anticipating.
There is a wariness, obviously, at times, not just to go through the default list of pre-Olympic scare stories and ensure there are actually specific concerns and issues that they are addressing. Obviously, we are at a particular heightened sense of geopolitical tensions around the world that has raised the security threat. Yet on the other side, we've had sort of more familiar scare stories, perhaps around bed bugs. We had the Zika virus in Rio 2016. There's often talk about gridlocked roads. So we as a media, obviously, having seen a few games, have to assess really what are the real challenges.
Yeah, there are sort of standard things which come up with every Olympic Games and every World Cup, and there's sort of some hardy perennials. But I do think actually the security in Paris, given especially the sort of international situation at the moment, is a very real issue.
We've also been hearing from the IOC president, Thomas Bach, this week, and particularly talking about the team that normally won't be there, Russia, although there will be Russian athletes competing, and some attempted tough talk from the IOC chief.
Yeah, the kind of language he has not used about Russia in the sort of best part of a decade since the Russian doping scandal broke. I don't know what has changed, but suddenly, the words he was using, the sort of attacks on Russia, is something that a lot of people think that the head of the Olympic movement should have done many years ago. Back in, we're talking, I think, is it 2014 when the first Russian doping scandal report was done by Hajo Sapelt, the German investigative journalist. So it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, and I don't know, corrupting and ruining in various ways several other games after that, with more of that state-backed scandal coming to light, and then the attempt to cover it up. But as you say, case of too late. Rob, tough talk from Thomas Bach now, but again, this is a week when we can see the difference in between what the IOC is planning to do with Russia and what the people who organise the Paralympics are trying to do. They seem to be, and as they have been, I think, for years, a lot tougher on Russian bad behaviour.
Yes, there was a sense often in the past that the IPC was acting in a stronger way. They are barring any Russians and Belarusians from the Paralympic ceremonies completely.
Yeah, I think we might get to a situation now where Putin doesn't allow any Russians to go because he's so annoyed about the way the IOC have been moving. That wouldn't surprise me if we get to that situation.
You mean like the sense that it's one humiliation too many. We don't want to be standing out and like embarrassed in this way by the kind of League of World Sports Nations.
So he made a sort of point after the last Winter Olympics in Beijing, and he sort of made a fuss of the Russian athletes who'd won medals as neutral athletes, and there was a big event for them, and he was like seen with their arms around various winners, including Kamila Valieva, the teenage ice skater who had tested positive for a banned drug and has since been banned. But but I just get the impression the IOC have decided that they're going to change their approach, and that's probably not going to go down very well in Moscow.
Overall, though, even though Russians will only be competing as neutrals at the Olympics and Paralympics, those who are approved, ultimately, whether it's in Britain, broadcast media, on the official broadcast, they will still be referred to in some way as Russians. So they are effectively competing there. All they will lack is an anthem on the podium if they were to win.
Yeah, and that kind of imprint and flags and that type of pageantry. But like you say, once the games begin, like it's a Russian person or a Russian athlete. They won't have, obviously, teams there. So in none of the team sports, there's not going to be any Russian representation. But, one of those that's been dragging on for a number of years.
We are talking about Olympics and hosting. This week we've actually been hearing from the UK about future event hosting plans. And one thing very noticeable from the list produced by UK Sport, a list that basically goes a couple of decades forward, there's no targeting of the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games.
Or the Men's World Cup. So actually, I look back and they did a similar thing in 2018, and they were targeting the Men's 2030 World Cup, 2026 Ryder Cup, and the 2031 Rugby World Cup. They haven't got any of them. They've all gone elsewhere. Now they're focusing on the Women's World Cup in perhaps 2031 or 2035. And Simon Martyn, the CEO, I think he made it pretty clear that that's what the UK should go for. They've never hosted it before, the biggest sports event they've never hosted before. But I mean, people say, well, hang on a minute, why isn't England trying to get the Men's World Cup again as well? Because since they last hosted it, Mexico will have hosted it 3 times in 2026. Lots of other countries have 2. The USA will have hosted it twice since then. There is a feeling that perhaps English football is paying the price of being unpopular at FIFA.
Although FIFA were in Scotland last weekend when we were there for the IFAB meeting, mixing with the home nations, although that is enforced through IFAB.
Yeah, I think maybe it's also more that there's sort of the people who run FIFA have different ideas and different priorities, and taking the World Cup to England doesn't fit in with them. The Men's World Cup, the Women's World Cup may.
I think it's the easiest chance now for England to host the World Cup because, as we've seen, in a popular vote of 211 national FAs, England isn't very popular. But now we've seen the World Cup is just handed out by the FIFA president or 4 people around him. If that's the group you need to curry favour with, it might be easier now for England in that sense. And FIFA also in England this week, funny enough, a drive-by visit from Arsene Wenger and the FIFA Secretary General ad interim, I believe, Matthias Grafstrom, to drop the best awards off to the winners at Manchester City. I think some players there were named in Teams of the Year and other awards at City, so they were there. So, yeah, FIFA do come and go.
Just to go back to the UK sport thing again, Rob, I thought the Commonwealth things were actually, in a way, that the lack of a sort of Commonwealth Games bid was more startling perhaps than the Olympic Games one, because they have hosted it in 2012. It's not that long ago. But to say they're not going to look at the Commonwealth Games, does that not just create a huge uncertainty over whether actually there is going to be any more Commonwealth Games? Because if the UK is not going to target that in the foreseeable, even long-term future, what's going to happen?
Well, we called it here a few weeks or months ago. We believe that the Commonwealth Games is dead. So, I'm going to speak for both of you here. So, maybe, I don't know, if we add Saudi Arabia to the Commonwealth, maybe there's someone who could potentially come to its rescue.
Well, they are in talks for some other sports investment potentially. We'll get into that later. Of course, Manchester City benefiting from the Commonwealth Games in 2002, ultimately moving into that stadium. Stadium angst, of course, in other parts of the country. United looking at a new Old Trafford. One of those incredible things, perhaps, of the Roman Abramovich era owning Chelsea is they never sorted the stadium out. They never managed to significantly renovate the stadium, move into a new place. So they're still held back in terms of the revenue on match days from not having a vast stadium like some of their counterparts. It's about 40,000, isn't it, Stamford Bridge? And this week, a greater insight into all the post-Abramovich finances at Chelsea has been revealed, and how things are under Todd Bowley, Clearlake Capital and all the others in terms of the scale of the losses from all that spending. Spending, though, on players and, of course, not infrastructure.
Yeah, so we've had the results of Blueco 22, which is the sort of holding company. It gives a sort of a very strong indication of Chelsea's, and Chelsea have announced some figures themselves, but not everything. So I think the bottom line is Chelsea made a £90 million loss last season. That was on top of 120 million loss the season before. So that is, to me, really, really bad news, because this season they haven't got Champions League income, so that's 80 odd million they're not going to be without. And they've, to me, it looks like their wage bills last season went up significantly. We only have the total wage bill for Blueco, which was 441 million. But given that Chelsea's the season before was 340 million, to me that looks like sort of, they're going to be the second highest payers in the Premier League behind Manchester City, and that's not sustainable when it comes to the amount of income they've got coming in. And it looks very much to me as though, unless there's going to be another sort of fire sale of homegrown players, Conor Gallagher, Reece James, that they could be in big trouble in terms of the profit and sustainability rules in a year's time.
Ziggs, if that's the case, it's peculiar when I say that. I mean the wage bill, because when they came in, these are the smartest boffins in the room, these great American finance guys who figured out a way to hack English football. The point was that all of these signings are going to be coming in on lower wages. So the idea that the wages are going up is really troubling, because the price tags, the ticket numbers for the players, midfielders 2 for 100 million, Modric for around, these are big numbers. But the way they explained it was, well, the really long contracts and on lower wages, which always seemed a little bit questionable. And now there's this looming date to kind of make these numbers work out in a way that doesn't affect PSR in such a way that they're going to get seriously punished. June the 30th, because that's when the financial year ends. There's going to have to be a fire sale. And as you said, these English players and fans love homegrown talent, don't they? It's a real mess.
And of course, a fire sale is never ideal when rival clubs then know that you've got to offload players, so it's harder to generate cash. We saw this perhaps with Everton and Richarlison, where they thought that they got £20 million less than he was worth from Tottenham. It ultimately led to them failing the PSR rules in the Premier League. So it's pretty difficult to offload a load of players in these conditions. And given Chelsea's status, they are 11th in the Premier League. It's pretty incredible, isn't it? As we record, played 26, won 10, lost 10, drawn 6.
Yeah, and every place in your sort of below your target in the Premier League costs a lot of money. So if they finish 10th compared to 4th, in itself that's 20 million quid. So I'm not. I imagine. I mean, the club are saying that they have complied with the profit sustainability rules and UEFA's financial fair play rules, which we know they have so far. But I think the worry is whether they'll be able to do so in the future. I mean, sounds like they probably won't have to worry about UEFA, because they look like it's going to be very unlikely they're going to qualify.
Well, we've got the FA Cup still to come, so there's that one avenue left. I mean, this talk of PSR has dominated talk around the Premier League recently. You've got Nottingham Forest and Everton, and now Martyn, another team that could be hit with Premier League PSR regulations, but isn't playing in the Premier League. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, a sort of strange, complicated case of Leicester City. Leicester City, they were relegated to the Championship last season. After they were relegated, the Premier League had a meeting, and the clubs agreed to change the rules so that every club had to report their financial accounts by a deadline of December 31st. That didn't apply to Leicester City because they'd been relegated before that law change. So they still had, because they'd been in the Premier League for the previous 3 years, they still had to submit their accounts, but they didn't have to do so until March. So there's been this strange situation where it's a bit of a loophole where they've not had to respond and do a business plan for the EFL, despite the fact that the EFL thought they were going to breach the rules. But they are now in a position where it's possible that the Premier League could charge them in the next couple of weeks and then have an independent commission. And it wouldn't have to do it before the end of the season. It could run into next season. It could be this season. It may not be. So to me, it just highlights this whole thing as the whole Premier League's financial rules, I think, have now been shown to be full of holes, because I think lots of things that which never would have been imagined that would happen have happened. And it's crying out for a much more clear, transparent, and a more obvious thing, so people know exactly where they stand, what they do, what will happen if they cross this line. What will the punishment be? When will it take effect? There's nothing laid down in the rules. What happens if you breach by £10 million? That just gets left up to an independent commission. I just think generally that the whole system needs. I mean, they are reforming it, but I just think it's not before time.
It's surprising there isn't greater consistency. These aren't unimagined scenarios. You can easily set out how this could look in rule books in terms of sanctions, how you deal with it. For instance, clubs can be relegated from the Premier League, then they could potentially go back up again. So there could be potentially interlinked investigations. So questionable why that didn't exist in terms of clearly set out scenarios for the transparency. They have updated, though, the handbook, haven't they, to publish new guidelines in terms of things like the sanctions if you attempt to secure inflated sponsorship deals.
Yeah, I think Martyn's right in terms of it shouldn't be this complicated. It's a football competition. It's not some complex piece of engineering or building satellites in space. It should be pretty easy. There's 20 teams in the Premier League every year. There's 23 is it in the EFL. They move up and down, and this scenario could be possible. And in Leicester's case, they might have benefited in the past as well. When if they had not got promoted to the Premier League when they did the last time they might have been dinged by other EFL rules. Now they potentially benefit from this. It's not a great situation when it comes to fan angst over rules. You got teams that have been punished, fans thinking they're being unfairly punished, and you got others who are angry that teams are benefiting from potentially breaking the rules. It's just really, really not good enough that it's so vague and unclear.
So what's the next steps on Leicester? When will we discover their fate?
Well, I think we should know by the end of March what happens there with them and the Premier League. I mean, looking at their financial results, I think they're going to be in a bit of trouble. But I think it just highlights the fact. I mean, the slightly sort of ironic thing about this is that Leicester City were talking about taking legal action against Everton because they'd been relegated and Everton hadn't last season. It turns out that they might have been in a similar boat, but at least for last season, but not the season before. But yeah, it's all a mess.
What else has been happening in football this week? UEFA have concluded the draw for qualifying for the Women's Euros in 2025. Something that's pretty striking about this is they've conducted the draw just a month before the first qualifiers are played.
As far as women's football is concerned, there'll be people who think, again, they are kind of second-class citizens when it comes to these big sports bodies. They will talk a very big game now about women's football. We've seen that in practice as well with better prize money and other things. But there's still times like this when you think, why has this not been done before? And it makes you, again, wonder, as I'm perhaps an advocate for, is that women's football, the organisation of it, should be spun out of organisations where the priority has always been men's football and are still run by bodies and boards that are largely thinking about men's football. And this might be another example. But the other thing with the draw, Rob, you mentioned that there isn't that much jeopardy in that. So you see these groups and some of the teams, you can finish last in a group, but you could still continue into a playoff. So I'm not sure how challenging or how difficult these competitions are, the qualification competitions. That'll be interesting to watch.
It is a balancing act because one of the issues with qualifying in the past, particularly in Europe, was really one-sided games. So how much do they benefit either the teams at the top or those lower ranked sides in terms of them being absolutely trounced? Does that benefit them? Does it benefit the elite sides if it's just so easy? So they have created a sort of Nations League style format for qualifying. So it does mean you do get really competitive sort of competition in terms of the matches. So England play France and Sweden as well as Ireland in their group. So all teams who were at the last World Cup in Australia. Yes, there is an issue with the lack of jeopardy because even the fourth place team in the group does go into the playoffs. But yeah, they've had to try and work out a way of competitive gains, but ensuring somehow the big sides don't miss out. But yeah, the issue on qualifying and the draw itself is the fact that now there's just a few weeks for the first games for teams to sort their logistics out and to sort ticket sales out too. Another thing that caught my eye this week in women's football, it's the Under-20 Asian Cup, and Australia are playing South Korea in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And these were incredible scenes. We've seen sort of perhaps teams playing in a bit of snow before, but this was a pitch where it was covered in piles of snow at certain parts, cleared in other parts, and huge concerns about how safe it looked with players really struggling.
Yeah, there are amazing pictures from that match. The conditions, I mean, I'm sure if it had been in this country, in the UK, it would have been cancelled. But we have seen, in Major League Soccer in the USA, play matches continuing snowstorms. So I'm not sure if safety is necessarily an issue, because if you've got studs and stuff, that might be enough. But it's certainly, in terms of the sort of the behaviour of the football, I can't imagine it. I know it's the same for both teams, but I can't imagine it's. I mean, it's like when you play football when it's standing water on the pitch, it then becomes very difficult. I imagine it's the same sort of effect when you're playing in that sort of deep snow. But it's one of those things. The images look great, but you're just glad you're not out there playing.
Yeah, I think there's an element of gamesmanship by the host countries in some of these cases as well. I don't know what the rule is on snow, but thinking about men's qualifications, Bolivia play their home games at the highest possible altitude. Colombia play their qualifiers in the hottest place they can find as well. And the US, when they're playing teams from the Caribbean, tend to find the coldest, snowiest place for their home games as well. Against Mexico, famous game. So yeah, but I wonder what the line is, and this one from these pictures looks like it might have crossed the line.
In the report from the Australian network ABC, they noted AFC officials on the ground were asked by Football Australia staff about why the game was allowed to commence in such conditions, only to be directed to a general AFC media email address.
That sounds par for the course, doesn't it?
Well, teams are getting the same treatment perhaps as media at times.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't say yes. Don't ask me. Ask somebody else on an email address.
And then you get the out of office response. We're in Tashkent. We can't reply at the moment.
Yeah, they seem to just try to sort of let it drift by the AFC without any noticeable comment, despite how viral those scenes went. These sorts of issues highlighting perhaps disparities in the game in terms of gender equality. We do record on International Women's Day, and just this week, the Spanish FA has been fined by the Spanish government over the Women's World Cup from last year. This ongoing fallout from Luis Rubiales' non-consensual kiss on Jenny Hermoso. And we've been hearing from the Spanish Labour Minister this week, who talked about the FA sending the team to the World Cup without an equality plan and without harassment protocols, which is very serious. And they explain the reason for these fines, and we are sending a strong message that this has to change. There is no place for sexism in sport. So this is the sort of action that perhaps contrasts with a lot of the quite generic messages, like from football governing bodies, FIFA today, tweeting out, celebrating all the incredible women around the world. So sort of balancing out the celebration with the fact there are clearly huge things still needed to be done.
Yeah, I wonder how many FAs actually have around the world have equality plans and anti-harassment protocols. You can think of vast swathes of the world, these FAs. I doubt, thinking about who runs those and how they run, that they would have them. Some other news in women's football as well in England. Perhaps the best or one of the best players in women's football, Sam Kerr, was charged in London with a crime. Could you got some details of that?
Yeah, Sam Kerr, the Australia captain, such a huge presence in the Chelsea side in recent years. She has been charged with allegedly racially aggravated harassment of a police officer, an incident that happened in London last year. That's only just come to light, and she has denied wrongdoing, so it does mean she will stand trial. Obviously, the way things are in the UK, it's then hard to comment on an ongoing situation. Something that was quite just notable more broadly was the fact Football Australia did send out a media notice saying they had an event. This was the next day, hours after news of the charge emerged. And Football Australia said, basically to the media, we recognise you'll have questions about this, so they'll set aside time for James Johnson, the CEO, to discuss it, rather than perhaps some sports bodies where you think they might sort of completely shy away from those questions.
Yeah, Rob, just on the reporting of this, you're right. Once someone is charged in the UK, there are reporting restrictions.
Of course, Sam Kerr is out injured at the moment, currently following the ACL injury she suffered at the start of the year. So, she's already out of the Olympics. But elsewhere in women's sport, Martyn, something caught your eye about a London women's basketball team with a link to football.
Yeah, 777, the American investment company which is trying to buy Everton. They've also heavily invested in the British Basketball League and in the London Lions. Now, they've had some success with the London Lions, and the women's London Lions have got further in the Euro Cup than any British team has ever done before, got to the last four. However, they've now confirmed that they're not going to fund them to go into the Euro Cup next season. Basically, for financial reasons, they're going to scale back. They say they want to focus on the domestically, but it obviously people in basketball think this is a sort of hugely negative move, and perhaps also a little bit worrying about the amount of money that the 7-7 have to put into the sport.
And this is the basketball league and a basketball team. This would be comparatively small amounts for what 7-7 described itself as. If we're thinking about this bid for Everton that still hasn't been authorised, and the stories that we've all written about unpaid debt and unpaid salaries and financial problems within 7-7, this doesn't give you much confidence about whether they have the wherewithal to get this Everton deal done. The Premier League still looking at Martyn, and another court case in the US. You got some details about that. We both read the suit that's filed by a financial company.
Yeah, I mean this isn't the first one of these that has emerged with 777. It's quite a big one though. This is Obra Capital Management. They're saying that they loaned 777 $40 million, and the company then missed several deadlines to repay it. They rescheduled it, and it still wasn't repaid. And eventually, that they had to take over a couple of the companies that had been put up as security, but they were still short of $20 million. And then they say 777. They're alleging that they tried to effectively move two other cash-rich companies to somebody else's ownership to basically keep them out of reaches of Obra Capital, so that they couldn't get their hands on it. They're suing them in the Supreme Court in New York over this. They're claiming it's a fraudulent conveyance. Spoken to 777, they say they're declining to comment.
Yeah, I can see why, but it's interesting the details there, and you've gone through them in good detail. But one of the things that struck me was, as part of those loans, and it was a very simple kind of request. So can we have some oversight of your accounts? And they said, yeah. So both the accounts for 2020 of 777 and for 2021 when they extended this loan were just not provided. And again, another company that is showing the same level of behaviour. That report, Martyn, or the case, has mentioned some of the media articles in there. There was one from the Times of London mentioned there related to basketball, I think, and then one from the New York Times and Josimar. It just seems a case of when, not if, maybe this whole process comes to a crashing end.
Well, I mean, 777 would insist that there's no issues. I think that their sources close to them are saying that this is sort of opportunistic claims against them because people know they're in the public eye. But I think they met the Premier League. 777 met the Premier League this week for talks on the Everton takeover. So everything is still up in the air. I think for the sake of Everton fans, you hope it doesn't all come crashing down.
Yeah, that takeover certainly going on for some time. Well, we end where we talk about so often, Saudi Arabia and what's been happening there this week. They've had the World Masters of Snooker tournament that concluded with a victory for Ronnie O'Sullivan, just about £250,000 he won. We've got the Saudi Arabian Formula One Grand Prix on Saturday. Before then, big boxing fight, Ngannou, Joshua taking place in Jeddah.
Well, that's one of the least surprising things ever, that the Saudi Public Investment Fund is going to potentially sponsor athletics, because they're looking at just about every other sport. So, let's see what happens with that.
But guys, there was Rob mentioned the snooker, and we can't not talk about the golden ball. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, when they announced it, they announced an extra ball, a golden ball that is worth 20 points. We haven't talked about it today, and it went unpotted at the Masters. So this golden ball that would have led to the first 167 in snooker history. The wait goes on. So maybe next time, guys, when we talk about this tournament in Saudi Arabia, someone is able to put away a maximum 167 at a Saudi tournament. Turki Al-Sheikh, the head of the Saudi sport and entertainment body, he took the mic and he announced he'll double the prize money for next year's event. Here's what he said. Hello, everybody. Today in this competition, no one had the golden ball. For that and for the next competition, they're going to double the prize money to $1 million. So there you go.
It's a rollover.
Players. Yeah, it's a rollover.
Often mentioned on this pod, because he blocked Tariq on Twitter.
Yes.
I had an interesting story about him, that apparently wherever he goes in sort of public places, somebody goes ahead of him spraying perfume, so he doesn't have to breathe in the odours of less fragrant people around him.
Well, people around him are certainly breathing in the odour of cash. So hopefully next year there'll be, for those snooker players, $1 million. I mean, Martyn, that reminds me of perhaps the rose bearers of the olden days, who used to put petals on the floor as the important people walked to wherever they needed to go. Now it's Arabian oud being sprayed in front of the rich and famous. How times are changing.
Yeah, how times have changed from snooker, those smoke-filled rooms of the past, perhaps in England.
Yeah. Couldn't be more different.
Yeah. Well, that about brings an end to this week's episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening, particularly those in Madagascar. As ever, if you hit subscribe, we land in your feeds automatically. And if you message us at Sport Unlocked on X, Facebook, and Instagram, perhaps we can read some of your comments out and answer your questions. But for now, thank you for listening. Goodbye.